Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ann Arbor District Library's AADL TV YouTube channel. Thanks for tuning in for tonight's presentation of Exploring the Mind with the University of Michigan Department of Psychology and Dr. Kai Cortina. In just a moment, Dr. Christopher Monk will introduce our guest. If you enjoy this program, don't forget to click like below and follow our channel for more AADL programming. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for tuning in. Today we're very fortunate to have Dr. Kai Cortina present some of his very interesting work. Kai is a professor in the Department of Psychology here at the University of Michigan. He received his PhD in educational psychology from the Free University in Berlin, Germany. The focus of Kai's research is on learning motivation in school, improving teacher practices, and the long-term effects of schooling over the life course. He is also an expert in statistics, and so he often uses advanced statistical approaches on international studies that examine school achievement as well as student learning. Kai's talk is entitled, "Do Teachers Respond Fairly to Misbehavior? Findings of a Mobile Eye Tracking Study in Regular Classrooms." Here is Dr. Kai Cortina.
Thanks, Chris, for this nice introduction. I'm sharing my screen and I hope, let's get started. Since Chris mentioned that I am an expert in statistics, while this is true, I promise you there is not much statistic. In the end, a little bit, but I will not focus on the statistics behind this. You have to, when I talk about effects that we find, you have to just believe me that they are statistically sound and proven. Yeah, so my talk, I might even have simplified the title, "Do Teachers Respond Fairly to Misbehavior?" And this is a research project that is based on an eye tracking study. So keep this question in mind. I will take you on a long journey, but I will come back to answer this very question. So again, welcome everybody. I'm so grateful that I got another opportunity to present research that we are doing in my research lab. So this remarkable series together with the Ann Arbor District Library. More than other fields in psychology, educational research needs the interaction with the field of study, which is mainly, in my case, the public school, the students, the teachers, and the parents. So today I want to report the findings of a study that is an offshoot of a larger research project funded by IES, the Institute of Educational Science, through a grant to my dear friend and colleague, Kevin Miller. And that grant is quite some years ago, before COVID. However, the research that I will present would not have been possible without the tenacity of my graduate student, Blake Ebright, who did the heavy lifting of coordinating the reanalysis of roughly 50 hours of classroom video for this project. The goal of this presentation is twofold. On the one hand, I want to answer the question in the title, namely, whether teachers are fair in their response to student misbehavior. On the other hand, I want to provide a little insight in the methodological challenges that we face even in answering relatively simple questions like the one presented. For the purpose of this talk, we narrow the notion of fairness to the question of ethnic and gender equity in the classroom. Do the teachers respond fairly to or evenly to misbehaviors in the classroom, regardless of sex and gender of the student? So let's start briefly reflecting on misbehavior in the classroom. As it is true for many terms in education and psychology, we believe we know what we're talking about until we try to measure them. Classroom misbehavior is not an exception. We have a common sense notion of what classroom behavior is, and then we need to be scientifically way more precise than in everyday language. While it is easy to get consensus that a student who hits a classmate is misbehaving, unless it is a boxing class maybe, The reality of the everyday classroom deals with infractions of classroom norms that are less extreme, but more common and unfortunately more ambiguous. So teachers differ in what they consider misbehavior in their classroom and how much they are tolerating it and how they respond to it. And to make matters worse, often the teacher's behavioral norms change throughout the class period. Here's an example. Sitting on the desk instead of sitting in the chair might be okay for the English teacher in the first class period, but it might be a complete no-no for the math teacher in the second period. For the American history teacher in the next period, it might be expected that everybody sits in their chairs for the first half hour, but for the seat work session halfway through class, it is okay to sit on the table for the small group discussion. This issue would certainly be a talk on its own, but I hope you trust me that we found a viable strategy to identify misbehaviors in a relative objective way. Despite these ambiguities in the definition of misbehaviors, the research on teaching expertise has consistently demonstrated that regardless how you define misbehavior in the classroom, experienced teachers have less of it and they are better at responding to it. I mention this here because the comparison of expert and novice teachers was a key aspect of the original study, and I will mention expertise differences today at one point. When we as educators talk about misbehaviors, we do this against the backdrop of the theoretical notion of what a good classroom looks like and what the fundamentals of classroom instructions are. In the discussion, I'm happy to go more into detail, but for now it suffices to say that there are roughly two schools of thought which are not mutually exclusive but emphasize different aspects. On the one hand, there is the traditional view of teaching as an art, which emphasizes the socio-emotional aspects of the interaction of the teacher with the students, based, for example, the ethic of caring. Nell Noddings is a renowned researcher in that school. But arguably the most famous representative of this line of thinking is Jacob Koonin and his concept of with-itness, which is an awful word and it always gets underlined by spell checkers. But it is, what he means with this is the teacher's competence to sense the beginning of students' loss of focus, and he is with the students, so he can or she can take sides, the teacher can take sides and sense where the students are currently socio-emotionally. So another concept of the with-itness research of Koonin is the concept of overlapping, which refers to a teacher's skill to quickly and effectively respond to student misbehavior without losing the momentum in the teaching. I will mention overlapping in that talk a lot, actually. So the alternative school of thought, which again is not mutually exclusive, but that is the idea to focus analytically on what techniques are helpful for a teacher to teach a class successfully. And this typically has a more an emphasis on the cognitive side of learning. So which way to present content helps the student better in their understanding. And this we call pedagogical content knowledge. And Lee Schulman is a very famous representative of that school. And in this category also falls the theory of classroom management, Brophy and Good, who coined that term, and that refers to, again, techniques that teachers have to control the classroom. And it is, one can make the case that with-itness of Koonin is a type of classroom management. Of course, I will not go deeper into that because I personally have a different distinction that is important for our presentation today. When we address empirical research on teaching in the classroom, I find it immensely more useful to keep another distinction in mind, namely the one between high and low inference approaches. Once you understand this difference, it is hard to forget about it, and that is for me the best proof of its usefulness. And high and low inference is something that is a distinction that is helpful also in other areas of psychology. High inference approaches are, to my personal chagrin, most common in educational research. High inference means that somebody, usually the student, the teacher, or an observer, provides the form of measurement. For example, we can ask the 23 students of a math classroom whether there is good classroom climate in class, using a rating scale from 1 to 5. Maybe we ask them 5 questions about that. Or we ask the teacher to rate the climate she experienced in the class. Or we ask a trained observer who is sitting in the class or watches a video what she thinks how good the climate was in this class. While these are very economical ways to produce data, it is often unclear what they really measure, because the measurement is done by other people, not by me, the scientist. Low inference approaches, on the other hand, are those measures that are simple statistics, often so simple that a computer can create the data and leave the interpretation to a later stage of data processing and, more importantly, to the scientist. For example, in our current study, we do not ask the teachers where they are looking at the moment during class, but we have a computer system record those data for us. But low inference would also be if an observer in a classroom you are an observer in a classroom and you simply take the time with a stopwatch when real instruction begins and when it ends in order to measure the effective time use. It does not require much training to distinguish between chit-chat about the latest local sports events and algebra the teacher switches to after 5 minutes of introduction. Our study that I'm presenting today combines the two approaches, because we start first by identifying misbehaviors in the classroom, which would be a high inference step. Then we check using a computer program whether the teacher actually paid attention to this misbehavior. That is the low inference component. And afterwards, we interpret the responses of the teacher, which is a high inference step. So we start with a high inference step, having a low inference step, and come back to the high inference step. So here's how the 3 steps look, one at a time. And here are the questions that we're addressing at each step. The first high inference step is the question, does the student misbehave? So doing the screening of stationary video footage, we identified student misbehavior and categorized it based on a rubric we developed. In the second step, the low inference step, we asked the question, does the teacher see it? So we use the mobile eye tracking system, which I will explain. And in the future, I will just call this MET, mobile eye tracking. And we use the MET to check whether the teacher has seen the misbehavior sufficiently, I will explain what that means, to potentially respond to it. If she has seen it, we follow up with the analysis of the reaction to it. As you will see, and I will document this, if they have not seen it, then there is no reason to look for response because the teacher doesn't respond to it. Makes sense, right? So on the next slide, I have just some statistics about the study itself. The grant was called Modeling and Developing Situational Awareness in Teachers, or MADSIT for short. We had more classrooms in the study, but only 23 classrooms we could analyze because we had both a student teacher and an experienced teacher in it. So 23 classrooms with a total of 538 students were analyzed for the purpose of this study. We had 2 class periods recorded for each classroom, one taught by the experienced teacher, and then the same subject taught a day or up to a week later. And then the class was taught by the student teacher. This is a very important feature of the design because we could directly compare differences between expert and novice teachers because they were teaching exactly the same students and the same subject. We have a huge variety in this study in terms of grade levels, but also with respect to subjects, that are taught, school subjects, but also with respect to the socioeconomic background of the neighborhoods the schools were in. It is all in Southeast Michigan, and Arbor is, by the way, included, but also schools that are more located towards Detroit. We had, the setup was for all classrooms is that the teachers were wearing the MET equipment, and we had two or three regular or conventional video cameras. The cameras were put in place so that all the students could be seen at least on one camera all the time. So let's start with the first step, the identifying and coding of the misbehavior. Remember, this is the high inference step. Does a student misbehave? That means we had to train a fleet of 10 undergraduate coders to really scrutinize those videos and always indicate when they see a misbehavior according to our rubric of misbehaviors. This rubric was developed with some pilot videos that we took, and we had in group discussions developed, when the first misbehavior was identified, we gave it a name, and then we looked for the next misbehavior and saw whether it falls under the same category, or we opened a new one. And this is called a hermeneutic circle because we went back to the very beginning once we had these 8 different categories and recoded the videos that we used to train ourselves with. We differentiate now 8 types of misbehavior. And each incident throughout all the videos was exactly attributed one label. If 2 were applicable, the coder gave the code for the more disruptive aspect. I will not go over all the 8 categories here, but I want to mention that those categories were developed by us and seem to be in part arbitrary. However, our undergraduates who were trained to use this rubric, they occasionally needed discussion about the differences between them, but have never expressed the need to add another one. So for that reason, we are quite confident this is a rather extensive list of misbehaviors we really see. Just as an aside, those misbehaviors of people that come to mind when people talk about it, like students hitting each other, for example, all fall under the category of other, and they are extremely rare. In our case, we almost never see that. So in order now in the second step to identify whether or not the teacher has seen the misbehavior, we use the MET equipment. The mobile eye tracker follows the movement of the pupil and can determine at which point a fixation of the eye happens, which means that the human focuses on an object in the field of vision with only minimal movement, so that cognitive process is actually possible. So when you see, so the lay understanding of seeing is cognitively a little bit more complex. So if you sit in the car and you drive and something passes by and it's technically in your vision, as long as you focus on this, you will not be able to cognitively process what you've seen or what was in your field of vision. So focusing on something is an important aspect of mobile eye tracking, because this is typically the unit of analysis that we are using. So we use fixation as the unit of analysis in all MET studies, not just whether somebody has seen something. On average, we record, just to give you a flavor of the numbers, we usually use fixation. On average, we record 4,276 fixation on a teacher in a 45-minute class period. And if you want to know what the teacher was fixating on, unfortunately, you need to analyze each individual still picture of that fixation moment. You can imagine how long it took us to code all the 222,338 recorded fixations in the context of our study. But for our study today, the use was a little simpler. Our research assistants simply had to determine whether the teacher focuses at least once on the student during the time the misbehavior happened. To give you an idea what an MAT video looks like, I have a 25-second clip on the next slide. I hope that works. Some people get seasick watching it, so when it happens to you, just look away for the duration of the clip. And I don't see the clip. Oh, there it is. Wonderful. I hope it starts.
Dass wir einfach mal gucken, wie sieht es aus mit den Formeln. Da würde ich Sie bitten, dass Sie einfach nach vorne gehen und wenn Sie eine Formel nennen können, sie eintragen. Ohne dass ich jetzt die einzelnen aufrufe, oder? Armin geht. Sie wollen wissen? Ja, man kann es wegmachen. So. Okay. Wir kämpfen ab und zu noch mit der neuen.
So I think that is probably enough. For reasons of data protection, I was showing you a clip from a German classroom that was recorded 10 years ago. The teacher has since retired, and she happily granted me permission to use it wherever I want. And this was a chemistry class in 10th grade. Let me go back to the slide before because I skipped that. So what the equipment needs, and this is what's important because you do not see the teacher in this video, right? So the teacher was wearing this kind of glasses that look like a little bit like a skiing mask. And this camera has two components. It records the visual field with a tiny little camera between the two eyes on the bridge of the nose in the camera. And it has two little cameras that go inside and shoot infrared light into the pupil and can record where the pupil is and how the pupil moves. And these two streams of information, the computer combines them. And this is what the video you saw shows the overlay of these two input channels. And what is important about the mobile eye tracking technology is that it only minimally interferes with the instruction, as you may have noticed. So the teacher can move freely around. The students get used to this very quickly. And we have, in the end, a low inference movie that we can analyze. So we see every time when you saw this little red circle, this is where the computer decided there is a fixation. You also have noticed that the circle was a little off, so it was a little ahead of the heads of the students. And this is due to the fact that video was shot without calibration. What you typically do, or we did for the actual data collection, is there is a 1 minute phase where we adjust the equipment. So because these two streams have to at one point be adjusted, and that step is called calibration. So as I mentioned, the mobile eye tracking served only one purpose, the low inference step, to identify whether or not the teacher has seen the misbehavior that our research assistants have identified. If they have seen it, we then had our research assistant code the teacher response. And as you can see, there is, again, the list of responses here. And for those of you who have experience in teaching, you will probably recognize what your favorite response is. So it is, for some teachers, it's quite common that if the misbehavior is strong enough, they address the entire class. Some teachers use nonverbal strategies. They just walk up to the culprit and just stand next to him or her. Sometimes we also see positive response of a teacher to something that is technically misbehavior. Very often you will see this in the data. This is when students talk out of turn. They give the right answer to a question that the teacher is desperate to get a response for. And then she will not mention that it was actually, that the student should raise the hand before saying anything. Very common is the reprimand. sometimes including even punishment but for the most part, it's just a very negative comment on the misbehavior. Some teachers use the strategy just to say the student's name very quickly. They let the students know that they didn't get away with something, so the teacher noticed, but they don't start a conversation about it. Or very often, teachers just do nothing. And here's for the category nothing, it's very important where the strength of our study lies, because the ambiguity, if the teacher does not do anything, we can distinguish whether the teacher did not see it and therefore didn't respond, or ignored it deliberately because, you know, he or she felt it wasn't necessary to respond. So now let's look at the results. And I want to begin with the misbehaviors we encountered in the 46 recorded classrooms. And I've just combined all the information for the simplicity of the talk. There are differences between classrooms, which I will not go into today. As you see here, is I've broken this down immediately by gender. And what is in boldface, these are differences, gender differences that are significantly different between for boys and girls. So first, when you look at the total numbers, you see that sorry, I can't see this here on my screen. You see that the most common infraction, the most two common infractions that are talking and off-task behavior. Since we all have been students, you know, we cannot pretend we are surprised about that. But this is important to always to remind ourselves that the most common misbehaviors are typically the ones that a lot of people consider more benign, but that does not mean that they are very disruptive for the teacher, for him or her to continue with instruction. So as I mentioned, for those of you who have teaching experience, it will not come as a surprise. But just as an aside, I have noticed in talks about this study that non-teaching audiences stumble over this finding. My explanation is that many people outside the teaching profession think that the occasional chat with a student sitting next to you or gazing out of the window for a minute does not qualify as misbehavior. But for teachers, these are behaviors that make their work stressful and not the fist fight, which according to coming of age movies happens on a daily basis, right? But of all the 3,393 misbehaviors we coded, we only saw 4 physical interactions, and only 1 was potentially harmful, causing maybe a bruise. So the most common misbehaviors, talking and off-task behavior. When we look at the gender differences here, you can see, if you assume that there's, which is true, roughly a 50-50 split between male and female students, that boys commit more norm infractions as common sense would have predicted. You see at the bottom line, we have 1,934 for boys and 1,459 for girls. Boys fidget more than girls and are more distracted, well, you know, show more off-task behavior, while girls show a penchant for chatting. So if we sum this up, yes, boys are more likely than girls to show infraction of the classroom norms. That is to be expected from our common sense experience. Talking and off-task are the most frequent infractions for both genders. Noticeable profile differences between boys and girls follow pretty much traditional gender stereotypes. We have the chatty Cathy and the fidgety Philip. When we differentiate the same misbehaviors by race, we also found characteristic differences in the profiles of the misbehaviors. White students were overrepresented in the category of talking in relative terms as presented here, but also in absolute terms when we take the percentage in the sample into account. African American students, on the other hand, were significantly more on record calling out or raising their hand while making noise to get the teacher's attention. Taking their proportion of the total sample into account, Black students were misbehaving more frequently, but only due to their higher rates in those two categories, namely calling out and hand raising. Note here that calling out and disruptive hand raising can be considered learning approach misbehaviors, which means that in their exuberance to participate, students forget their manners and blare out the right answer or shout me, me, me while raising their hands. As you will see later, these misbehaviors are not the ones teachers usually worry about. To sum this up, minority students, in particular African American students, are more likely to break behavioral norms in the classroom. However, the higher tendency of Black students to misbehave is due to learning approach misbehaviors. White students are more likely to engage in talking. Now we are moving to the next step, namely our low inference step, whether or not the teacher has seen or not seen the misbehavior. There are extreme differences in teacher awareness depending on the infraction. Calling out and disruptive hand raising are usually seen by the teacher, not surprisingly because the student craves for the attention of the teacher. Fidgeting, gesturing, and also the most frequent talking are rarely noticed by the teacher. You see that for talking, it's in 77% of the cases, the teacher has not seen this infraction. Overall, exactly 2/3 of misbehaviors go completely unnoticed by the teacher. Talking and off-task behaviors are the most often overlooked. Calling out and hand raising have the highest chance to be noticed. And when I talk about hand raising, I always mean disruptive forms of hand raising. When we focus on teachers' responses to misbehaviors, we are at this point logically forced to ignore 2/3 of the misbehaviors, namely all those misbehaviors the teachers have not seen. The reason is simple. When the teacher has not seen them, they will not respond to it. Or, to be precise, in our data, in 97.7%, there's a trivial non-response of the teacher. I don't need to present a table for that. But I mention this because it validates our approach. Is that if this had not been the case, if we had seen a lot of responses of the teachers, I would have questioned the rationale of the low inference step. Because we can now say, yes, if the low inference step demonstrates that the teacher has seen it, then she really had a chance to respond. If our study indicated, our low inference step indicated a non-response, it is a non-attention, it really means the teacher really has not seen it. And we come to this conclusion without ever asking the teacher herself. So in this table here, I have distinguished between expert and novice teachers. At this point, it is of interest to distinguish between the two, as you can see from what is highlighted where we see differences, Jacob Kunin would be very happy with these results because they are consistent with his theory of teacher expertise. Because strategies where experts and novice differ can be interpreted in terms of effective overlapping strategies. Walking up to a disruptive student and standing next to them, or simply saying their name, prevents the teacher from getting derailed from their instruction while still addressing the misbehavior in a subtle way. And you can see that that's the highlighted or the bold nonverbal, that is walking up to the student or says name. These are the responses that expert teachers do significantly more often. And on the other hand, novice teachers tend to address the class, the total class more often, which is the most stopping you in the tracks way of responding, because the teacher cannot continue with her instruction at this point if she does that. Up to this point, we have only looked at the teacher's responses regardless of what the infraction was, knowing quite well that the response will not only depend on whether the teacher has seen the infraction, but also what type of misbehavior it was. But if the teachers have seen the misbehavior, it is surprising how different the responses are, ranging from 45% positive or even encouraging responses for calling out, forgetting to raise the hand before, say, responding to a teacher. Or looking at the bottom of the table, it becomes clear that across all misbehaviors, the negative response is almost as common as a non-response. And here again, remember, the non-response is only confined to those cases where the teacher has actually seen the misbehavior. So to sum up, this response is the response of teachers. If a teacher has not seen the misbehavior based on MET, there's a 98% chance of non-response, which is trivial. Experienced teachers use more overlapping response techniques than novices. Novice teachers tend to resort to address the whole class for single misbehaviors, which disrupts instruction. Teachers rarely catch students talking or being off task, but if they do, they reprimand the students more often than not. Let me just go back to that slide here. So you see, for talking, if the teacher sees it, if she sees it, you see that we get a negative response in 52% of the cases. For off-task behavior, it's even higher, 58% of the cases. So while these are often overlooked, if the teacher sees them, she responds quite clearly to them, in particular if it's an expert teacher, by the way. So now I come back to the question of the demographics, whether or not the demographics matter. So you might have noticed that the analyses at this point are starting to getting very complex. The issue of fairness across demographic groups has so far only come up in the context of the misbehaviors themselves in the very beginning at the first inferential step, with high inference step, not regarding the attention and, most importantly, the response of the teachers. So let us start here with a simple insight. There is complete fairness in all cases where the teacher has not seen the misbehavior. There is no response to it regardless of sex or race of the student. That is hopefully easy to grasp, right? But joking aside, in all cases where a teacher has seen the misbehavior, they also processed consciously or unconsciously the sex and race of the misbehaving student. In our final step, we wanted to investigate for the seen infraction whether the reaction of the teacher is not only influenced by the type of misbehavior, we know that already, but also by the race and sex of the student. In order to do that, we use a technique called log linear modeling, which I refrain from even trying to explain, except for the logic on the slide you're seeing here. We started with the model, and that is the model 1, that assumes that all 4 effects are simply additive or called main effects, roughly following the results given above. So the results I've presented so far were all typically main effects. But this is not the full story, as the significant values, significant p-values, smaller than 0.019, that indicates that it's not sufficient to just use main effects. There are more complex effects in our data. So we have to include those 2 interactions between incident and race and incident and expert. We have to take into account to reproduce or to statistically explain our findings. So confirming our findings above, we do not find a differential effect for sex. Boys and girls are treated the same way for the same infraction. You also see that the expert and novices differ in their responses, an effect that was just discussed. So it is the race by incident interaction. So this model 2A, we want to understand a little better. For this purpose, we ran separate analyses for each individual infraction. Go to the next slide. So this is now our strategy here is I'm looking at all the cases where we saw calling out. And remember, calling out was done more often by African-American students. And I see, and I look for the effect of race with respect to the response of the teacher. So if I have given calling out, misbehavior calling out, does the teacher respond evenly whether or not this is a white boy or a black kid? And we do this separately for each individual infraction. As you can see, everything that is dark blue, there is no significant difference. So if a student is calling out, regardless of gender or race, we get no difference with respect to how the teacher responds to it. But we do see, for two infractions, differences by race. And that is talking, if there is talking, and if there is off-task behavior. So in order to look at this a little more in detail, so this is a very busy table here. So you see the top part is the analysis of the misbehavior talking. And you see there is the teacher reaction, and there is either non-response, negative response, or positive response. And you can see, and this is broken down by race. I'm focusing here on the differentiation between white and black students. And you can see that black students, if black students are talking and the teacher sees it, the response rate, negative responses, is much higher than for white children. So it's 70% versus 45%. And that is a statistically significant effect. And the same, exactly the same, even more extreme, we see for off-task behavior. If a teacher sees off-task behavior in an African-American kid, there is an 85.5% chance of a negative response by the teacher. While for white student, it will be only, but still majority, roughly 52%. What is important to note here is that these effects are cumulative. That means that since we have seen also gender effects, so a black boy who was noticed by the teacher to be off task has even a higher chance of 92% chance of a reprimand response. If that student is taught by the experienced teacher, this percentage goes even further up to 95%. Before we draw conclusions, let's summarize what we found so far. Most misbehaviors go unnoticed by the teacher and therefore remain unsanctioned. Second, misbehaviors follow gender stereotypes but do not confirm racial stereotypes. Black students have a higher rate of misbehaviors, but only to learning approach infraction, which teachers often ignore or even condone, as we have seen in particular for the calling out. Third, teacher responses are driven by the type of infraction. But controlling for the infraction, gender does not predict teacher reaction. But Black students experience stronger reprimand for self or other distracting behaviors. So now I come back to our original questions. Are teachers fair in their response to misbehaviors? For student sex, the answer is simple, yes. Because gender differences in teacher reaction were fully explained by the type of infractions, which differs stereotypically by gender. But if we hold constant the misbehavior, the response of the teacher is the same regardless whether it's a boy or a girl. Fairness with respect to race is another story. And that can be told in different ways with different spin. As a psychologist, I like to start with acknowledging the perception often described in the literature, namely that African American students feel that they get reprimanded more often than white students. Based on our findings, this perception is accurate. The common argument here is that Black students, in particular male students, tend to misbehave more and hence have more negative interactions with teachers. Surprisingly, the latter fact is true. African American kids do misbehave more often, but it is still not the cause for the more negative interactions with the teachers. The higher percentage of Black students' misbehavior is solely rooted in higher percentages of learning approach infractions. And these are the infractions that teachers are often willing to let slide in the interest of instructional progress. But teachers do seem to be more vigilant and responsive to those misbehaviors that ultimately jeopardize student learning progress. And that is off-task behavior and talking, because the students are distracted. One could argue that pedagogically, this is in the best interest of the student, or in this case, the Black student. But seen through the lens of critical race theory, it is possible that students find heightened scrutiny not only unfair, but also a form of racism. This perception might outweigh good pedagogical intentions. And thank you for your attention.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Kai. Try to figure out what I should do next. I have a couple of questions. I know that Jackie, you received a question from social media, but I can just go. I haven't seen that question yet, but I can just go ahead with my questions, Kai, if that's okay.
Sure.
So the first one was about the video that you showed, which I thought was remarkable. It just seemed like a very different world. And I was wondering, I totally appreciate that you're not able to share videos of kids and teenagers in the United States, but I was just wondering if anecdotally, from what you've seen of the videos and your knowledge of Germany and the United States, like how that might differ from what, like, the data you guys were actually working with in Southeast Michigan.
Frankly, there is no difference.
Really?
I have videos also. Last year, I shot several videos in Germany. And the only difference might be, and that had to do with the fact that I was working in Germany with teachers in training, that the novice teachers in Germany tend to walk around more in the classroom. And that has a significant effect on responses to misbehaviors. The short answer is, it's a good thing if a teacher walks around.
Okay.
And in the US, in particular, experienced teachers tend to not do that, which might be a training that during their initial training that was not important, or
Sure.
It's a matter of age. I don't know.
Sure. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. And the second question I had, I just received a question from Jackie, so I'll look at that in a moment. The second question that I had was, so you have a really nice broad age range, and going from, my memory was going from what, first grade to 11th?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, so I imagine, like, so you didn't dwell on the age differences. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the age differences. I imagine the types of misbehaviors would vary across age. I was wondering if
Yes.
you had,
Yes, that is definitely true, and I could not go into that. It is also a little difficult because the pedagogy is so different for elementary schools and middle and high school. So it's always easier to focus on the classroom situation in middle and high school, because that follows more the stereotype. You have kids sitting in their chairs and at desks, while in elementary school, you often have the kids sitting in front of the teacher on the carpet. And then there are very different misbehaviors. And I mentioned the physical misbehaviors. This is something we only observe in first and second grade. And kids sit really very close to each other, and then they might, just make a movement and hit by mistake another one, and then this kid, boxes back. So yes, there are qualitative differences by over the course of the school career. That is definitely true. But we have not, and frankly, we have not really analyzed it that much, because when we would really differentiate by grade, we reach our limits in terms of the amount of data we have to really analyze them well. I do know, however, that the number of infractions of misbehaviors goes down in general. So we see more misbehaviors in elementary school, in particular beginning elementary schools, than middle and high school. And this is what you would expect, because the kids socialize into the classroom setting and the behavioral norms in the first years.
Great, thank you. And the question from social media comes from Katie, and she asks, would love to hear thoughts on how this might apply in virtual classrooms too. So I think, I'm extrapolating here, but I think she's asking particularly about, the use of eye tracking, or maybe the use of different kinds of misbehavior. Do you have thoughts about either of those?
It's funny that this is a very good question, and I actually do have thought about this, because I think our research, shows the real dangers of virtual teaching, because teachers, for very good reasons, are very concerned about students getting distracted, students not paying attention, being off task. And as the study, as I showed, off task is one of the most common infractions we see in a regular classroom, where the teacher has more control over, kind of reining in, it's the shepherd of attention in a way. In the virtual classroom, the teacher has very limited means to get kids who get sidetracked, back on track. Just anecdotally, my son, who is in 10th grade, the teachers plea that the kids, turn the cameras on in a virtual classroom, but they can't force it. Mm-hmm. So they craved to at least to have a visual control that emulates what would be possible in the classroom. So I would actually say this is one of the big problems in terms of teaching and classroom teaching in the virtual spaces, that the teachers cannot really control the attention or monitor the attention of the students.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Do you have are there questions? I know these are very new data, and so maybe you've not had the chance to present these to other audiences. Are there other common questions that come up?
I have presented this actually to larger audiences when we were halfway through the data analysis. Oh. And thank goodness, I did not change the story to have the full coding. The question that comes up is, of course, a little thorny, and that is the question: what should we do about the race effect that we see in the data? On the one hand, I have, and I hope that I was able to convey this, that this is a complicated issue. It is not simple. It is not that the Black students misbehave more. It is the type of misbehavior that really tells the story here. But what should a teacher do? Pedagogically, I would say, yes, you have to be more consistent in negatively responding to off-task and talking also for the white kids. So I would more make, I feel most comfortable making the cases the white kids, are missing out on pedagogical guidance. So the Black kids get the better pedagogy on the teacher, which might they perceive as more controlling, but from an educational perspective, that's not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. So my cop out would be here, or the teacher should, also focus and should be more consistent, or that would be if it were for teacher training, or this is what I did last year in Germany in the teacher training class. Make sure, do not, in particular as a novice teacher, do not ignore off-task behavior. A child that looks out of the window is a problem that might trigger more misbehavior of this student or another student. And this student is not following the instruction and might get lost quickly. This is always my story, although I'm not really happy about my own story here. Because if a teacher would really do that, that would require more disruptions. There's more chance that the teacher focuses on classroom management. And if we only focus on classroom management, there is no content taught in a classroom, right? Then the progress in terms of the instruction is then very slow. So I'm afraid I have no real good answer to that question that often comes from the audience. I understand, I appreciate the question. I would have the same question, but I'm not good at giving an answer. Here's the division of labor. I'm a scientist. I'm not, a teacher trainer or a practitioner. I can push this off to those who do in particular teacher training.
So one of the novelties of this whole project, I think, is the eye tracking, which is very cool. What's the experience of the teacher using that? And I mean, do they forget it's there, or is it cumbersome? And how do you see this being used in the future as well?
Yes. Oh, this is now the technology that they have nowadays is even more lightweight. So the teachers sometimes complain about the weight on the nose. Oh. So when I use it, for example, I have a red spot here on the bridge of my nose, and that is because of the weight. And also the old devices, the sides of the glasses get hot. So you get kind of at the temples, you're heating on the temples, which sometimes if you record in the middle of the summer, it really, really makes teachers sweat. Oh, yeah. These are the major complaints. I do think, having worn it myself doing instruction, as a teacher, your adrenaline and your focus on the teaching is so strong that you completely forget, in particular, the wire that goes down your back into the fanny pack. I have to speak for myself. I completely forget that. And what is noticeable is that the students also completely forget that in the beginning, even in elementary school classes. Sometimes, the teacher makes initially a joke, oh, look at my fancy glasses, and then, but that's pretty much it. So nowadays, the glasses that you can use, there's Tobii is a very expensive brand. You can even have, correction lenses with it. So you could almost wear glasses that the students would not even see that there is recording. There's a lot of progress. So I do see, and I would always advertise to use this in particular in teacher training. This is what I personally have done last year in a class I taught in Germany. I have students recordings of the classroom with their mobile eye tracking and have them themselves see themselves teaching. And there is one big advantage of using the mobile eye tracking, and that is you don't see yourself. So people get very self-conscious if they see a video of themselves teaching, but from a teacher training perspective, that is not important. Whether you have a little tick or something that bothers you if you see yourself, it's more important to see how do you interact with the students, how do you respond to student questions, and this is much more, it's easier for the student teacher to see and approach and discuss if they don't see themselves. So the mobile eye tracking is a very effective tool for triggering discussion feedback about effective teaching.
Okay, great. Are there other questions that have come up when you've presented this?
Yes, so when I present this to teacher trainers, I was asked, how expensive is that equipment? And you don't want to hear the answer. Well, I should qualify this. When we bought the equipment, I think it was about $50,000 for a set of goggles and the entire package. Now we are probably down to $10,000.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but it is, I mean, it's still expensive.
Yeah.
But there is a do-it-yourself kit that you can order. So if you don't mind, doing some handiwork, you can get an equipment that uses your computer and the software for about $250.
Wow.
So but that's not everybody's cup of tea to do this
Right.
themselves.
Yeah, but in terms of teacher training, it could be a good, additional tool.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, and this is also, I think, very important, that the acceptance of this with student teachers is tremendous. That student teachers love, once they have seen themselves teaching with the mobile eye tracking, they do not like to go back and look at regular video, stationary video. And the main reason is the stationary video optimizes or is shot from the perspective of the student, which is fine, but the teacher wants to see, the perspective of the teacher. So if I, as a student teacher, see an expert teacher teaching, it is more instructive for me to see the mobile eye tracking video than the stationary camera. Because I would see, for example, how the teacher is monitoring the classroom. So an experienced teacher focuses more on the students, and you can see this in mobile eye tracking video, that the experienced teacher, very often while she's talking, she's looking systematically through the rows and makes sure that every student actually pays attention. And then we come back full circle, because off-task behavior is the most critical for learning.
Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. Well, thank you very much, Kai. And thank you for being the first to do this virtually. It's been an adventure. So
Yeah.
very much appreciated.
It has been fun.
Okay. Thanks.